The late afternoon sun blazed down on the cracked asphalt of Murphy's Diner parking lot. Betty Jenkins slowly made her way across the hot pavement, her worn sneakers making soft shuffling sounds with each careful step. At 73 years old, she had learned to take her time. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and the heat made everything feel twice as heavy. Betty clutched her old brown leather purse close to her chest. The bag had seen better days, just like everything else in her life. The strap was frayed and one of the corners was completely worn through, but it had been her mother's and she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Inside, she carried the usual things, her reading glasses, a few crumpled tissues, her house keys, and exactly $17.32. Not much, but enough to buy groceries for the next few days. She had just finished her monthly lunch with the ladies from church. Every third Thursday, the same group of 6 women met at Murphy's for their chicken and dumplings special. They talked about their grandchildren, shared news from the neighborhood, and caught up on who was doing well and who needed prayers. Today, they had spent extra time discussing Mrs. Patterson's new hip surgery and planning a meal train for the Hendersons, whose youngest son had just deployed overseas. As Betty walked toward her old blue Honda, she noticed the rumbling sound before she saw them. The deep, throaty roar of motorcycle engines filled the air, growing louder by the second. She glanced up to see a group of motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. Big bikes. The kind that made the ground vibrate when they rode by. The kind that always made her a little nervous. There were 6 of them, all riding in a tight formation. Their bikes gleamed with chrome and custom paint jobs. The riders wore black leather jackets, heavy boots, and bandanas. Some had tattoos covering their arms, and most wore dark sunglasses even though the sun was starting to set. They looked like they meant business, whatever that business might be. Betty tried not to stare as she continued toward her car. She had been taught not to judge people by how they looked, but something about this group made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way they rode so close together, like a pack, or maybe it was the way they seemed to be looking around the parking lot, studying everything and everyone. The leader of the group was a big man with a thick beard and arms like tree trunks. His bike was the loudest of all, painted black with flames down the sides. When he pulled into a parking space near the diner entrance, the other riders followed his lead, creating a wall of motorcycles that blocked the view from the street. Betty was almost to her car when she heard the engines shut off one by one. The sudden quiet felt strange after all that noise. She fumbled in her purse for her keys, hoping to get in her car and drive away before any trouble started. Not that she expected trouble exactly, but she had lived long enough to know that sometimes it was better to be safe than sorry. That's when she heard the voices. Well, well, well. Look what we have here. Betty's hand froze on her car door handle. The voice was deep and rough with a tone that made her stomach clench. She didn't turn around, but she could feel eyes on her back. Looks like somebody's lost, boys. Laughter followed. Not the kind of laughter you heard at a family gathering or when friends shared a joke. This was different, harder, meaner. Betty's fingers finally found her keys, but her hands were shaking now. The simple task of finding the right key suddenly felt impossible. She could hear footsteps on the asphalt behind her getting closer. "You need help there, Grandma?" The voice was right behind her now. Betty closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and turned around. The big man with the beard was standing just a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. Up close, she could see that his leather jacket had patches sewn onto it. One said "Road Devils" in red letters. Another showed a skull with flames coming out of its eyes. The other 5 bikers had gotten off their motorcycles and were walking over to join their leader. They formed a loose circle around Betty and her car, not close enough to be obviously threatening, but close enough to make it clear she wasn't going anywhere without their permission. "I'm fine. Thank you," Betty said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned back to her car and tried again to find the right key. "Oh, I don't think you're fine at all," the bearded man said. "I think you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here's our spot." Betty looked around the parking lot. There were no signs saying it was reserved. No markings on the ground, just a regular diner parking lot. The same one she had been using for her monthly lunches for the past 5 years. "I'm sorry," she said, still not looking at them directly. "I was just leaving. Were you now?" The man's voice had a mocking tone that made Betty's chest tighten. "That's real convenient. But see, here's the thing. You've been using our parking space, and that means you owe us." Betty finally found her car key. But when she tried to put it in the lock, her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't get it in. The key scratched against the metal around the lock, making a sound that seemed incredibly loud in the quiet parking lot. Inside the diner, she could see faces pressed against the windows. Other customers had noticed what was happening outside. Some were pointing. Others were reaching for their phones. But nobody was coming outside to help. Nobody was opening the door to ask if she was okay. Betty had lived through enough to know that sometimes you couldn't count on other people to step in. Sometimes you had to handle things yourself, even when you felt small and scared and completely out of your depth. The bearded man stepped closer. Betty could smell leather and motor oil and something else she couldn't identify. When she glanced up at his face, she saw he was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said he was enjoying this, that he liked seeing her scared. "Cat got your tongue, old lady?" he asked. "Or are you just thinking about how you're going to pay what you owe us?" Betty looked at her car, then at the bikers surrounding her, then at the diner windows where people watched but did nothing. For a moment, she felt completely alone in the world, just a 73-year-old woman with arthritic hands and $17 in her purse, facing down 6 men who seemed to think intimidating her was some kind of game. But somewhere deep inside, in a place she hadn't visited in a very long time, something began to stir, something that remembered what it felt, like to stand up straight and look trouble in the eye. The bearded man, whose leather jacket read Tank, took another step closer to Betty. She could see the details of his face. Now the scar running through his left eyebrow, the gold tooth that caught the light when he smiled, the way his eyes seemed to enjoy her fear. "You deaf, lady?" Tank's voice got louder. "I asked you a question. You've been parking in our spot and now you owe us for the privilege." Betty's mouth felt dry as cotton. She tried to speak, but only a small croaking sound came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. "This is a public parking lot," she said, her voice still quiet but steadier than before. "I don't owe anybody anything." The other bikers laughed. One of them, a thin man with long, greasy hair and multiple ear piercings, slapped his knee like Betty had just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Public parking lot," he repeated, his voice high with mock surprise. "Did you hear that, Tank? She thinks this is a public parking lot." Tank shook his head slowly like he was dealing with a child who just didn't understand how the world worked. "See, that's where you're wrong, Grandma. Maybe it used to be public, but things change. The road devils ride through this town every month, and when we do, this becomes our territory. Call it a temporary lease agreement." Betty looked around again. The parking lot was maybe half full. There were plenty of other spaces these men could have used. They didn't need hers. This wasn't about parking at all. This was about power, about proving they could take whatever they wanted from whoever looked like they couldn't fight back. "I don't have any money," Betty said, which was mostly true. $17 wasn't exactly money, not the kind these men would care about anyway. "Oh, I bet you do," said another biker, this one with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos. "Old lady's always got money hidden somewhere. Maybe not in that raggedy purse, but somewhere." He pointed at Betty's car with a thick finger. "Nice little Honda there. Bet that's worth something. Maybe we take that instead of cash." "You can't take my car," Betty said, louder this time. "I need it to get home, to get to the store. I can't walk everywhere." "Should have thought about that before you parked where you don't belong," Tank said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his keys. "Tell you what, though. I'm feeling generous today. You give us $50 and we'll call it even. A small fee for using our premium parking space, $50. Betty almost laughed if she hadn't been so scared. $50 was groceries for a week. It was her electric bill. It was 3 tanks of gas for her little car. Even if she had $50, which she didn't, she wouldn't give it to these men for nothing. "I told you I don't have $50, she said. Tank's smile disappeared. "Then I guess we got a problem." By now, more people in the diner had noticed what was happening outside. Betty could see them clearly through the windows. Families with children, elderly couples, working people just trying to enjoy their dinner. Were holding up their phones, recording everything. Others looked worried but stayed safely inside. One young waitress, probably not much older than Betty's own granddaughter, had her hand on the door handle like she might come outside. But an older man at her table grabbed her arm and shook his head. "Don't get involved," his gesture said. "Not your business," Betty understood. These people had their own families to worry about. Their own problems. Getting mixed up with a motorcycle gang wasn't something most folks were prepared to do, even to help a stranger. "Here's what's gonna happen," Tank continued. "You're gonna open that purse and give us whatever you got. Then you're gonna give us your car keys. We'll drive your little Honda around the block a few times just to make sure it runs good. Call it a test drive. Then maybe we'll give it back. Maybe." Betty's voice cracked on the word. "Well, that depends on how cooperative you are. You give us any trouble, and we might decide we like your car better than our bikes. Much more comfortable for long trips." The thin biker with the long hair walked closer to Betty's car and ran his finger along the hood. "Yeah, this is nice, real nice. Better than walking, that's for sure." Tank reached out toward Betty's purse. "Come on, Grandma. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just hand over the bag." That's when Betty did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped backward, pressing herself against her car door and held her purse tighter to her chest. "No," she said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. Tank's eyebrows went up. "What did you say?" "I said no." Betty's voice was still quiet, but there was something different about it now. Something that made the bikers look at each other uncertainly. "Lady, I don't think you understand the situation here," Tank said. "There's 6 of us and 1 of you. You're 70 years old and probably weigh about as much as my left boot. You really want to do this the hard way?" Betty looked at each of the men surrounding her. They were all bigger than her, younger than her, stronger than her. Any one of them could probably take her purse without even breathing hard. But for some reason that fact didn't scare her as much as it had a few minutes ago. "I understand perfectly," she said. "You're bullies. You pick on people you think can't fight back because it makes you feel big and important. Well, I may be old, but I'm not helpless." The biker with the shaved head laughed. "Oh, this is rich. Grandma thinks she's tough." "I don't think I'm tough," Betty said. "I know I'm not. But I also know right from wrong. And what you're doing is wrong." Tank's face was getting red now. Betty could see that he wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not elderly women in church clothes. His whole reputation probably depended on people being too scared to say no. "Last chance, lady," he said. "Give us the money and the keys or we take them anyway. And trust me, you don't want us to take them." Betty looked once more at the people watching from inside the diner. Some of them had their phones up, definitely recording now. Others looked away, uncomfortable with what they were seeing but unwilling to help. Then she looked at Tank and his 5 friends. 6 grown men who had decided that threatening a grandmother in a parking lot was a good way to spend their afternoon. Betty took a deep breath. In her mind, she could hear her late husband Robert's voice from all those years ago. "Sometimes, Betty girl," he used to say, "you got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything." She thought about her grandson Tommy, who was starting high school next month. What would he think if he knew his grandmother had been bullied in a parking lot and just handed over everything she had without a fight? She thought about all the strong women who had come before her. Her mother, who had raised 5 children during the Depression. Her grandmother, who had marched for the right to vote. Her great-grandmother, who had been born into slavery but died a free woman who owned her own land. "You want to know something?" Betty said, her voice stronger now. "I've been pushed around before. By people a lot scarier than you. And I'm still here." Tank's hand moved toward Betty's purse again, but this time she was ready for him. As Tank's hand reached for her purse, something remarkable happened to Betty Jenkins. Her back straightened. Her shoulders squared. The trembling in her hands stopped completely. For the first time since this whole encounter began, she looked directly into Tank's eyes without flinching. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said. Her voice was different now. Not the quiet, scared whisper from before, but something else entirely. Something that carried weight and authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Tank's hand stopped mid-reach. There was something about her tone that caught him off guard. It was the kind of voice people used when they knew something you didn't. When they had cards you hadn't seen yet. "Oh, really?" Tank said, trying to keep the mocking tone in his voice. But Betty could hear the uncertainty creeping in. "And why's that, Grandma?" Betty didn't answer right away. Instead, she calmly opened her purse and reached inside. The bikers tensed, probably expecting her to pull out pepper spray or maybe a small knife. What she pulled out instead was her cell phone. It was an old phone, the kind with actual buttons instead of a touchscreen. The kind that looked like it could survive being dropped off a building. Betty flipped it open with practiced ease and began scrolling through her contacts. Because, she said without looking up from the phone, you have exactly 10 seconds to get back on your motorcycles and ride away. The bikers burst into laughter, even louder than before. The thin one with the long hair actually doubled over, slapping his knee again. 10 seconds, he wheezed. Or what? You gonna call the police? Lady, it'll take them 20 minutes to get here and we'll be long gone. Oh, I'm not calling the police, Betty said calmly. She found the contact she was looking for and highlighted it with her thumb. I'm calling someone much closer. Tank stepped forward again. I don't know what game you think you're playing, old woman, but… 5 seconds, Betty interrupted, her finger hovering over the call button. Something in her voice made Tank pause. The other bikers stopped laughing. There was a confidence in her tone that didn't match the situation at all. She was still outnumbered 6-1. She was still 73 years old and standing alone in a parking lot. But somehow she didn't seem scared anymore. You're bluffing, Tank said, but he didn't sound as sure as before. 3 seconds, Betty said. She pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. Betty spoke just 2 words into the phone. Code silver. Then she hung up. The parking lot fell completely silent. Even the bikers had stopped shuffling around. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, though nobody knew what. Code silver? Tank said. What kind of nonsense is that supposed to be? Betty slipped her phone back into her purse and looked at him with something that might have been pity. You'll find out, she said simply. For a full minute, nothing happened. The bikers looked at each other, clearly wondering if they should just grab Betty's purse and get out of there. But something about her complete lack of fear was throwing them off their game. Tank opened his mouth to say something, probably another threat, when a new sound reached their ears. It was distant at first. A low rumbling that could have been thunder, except the sky was clear. The sound grew louder and it became obvious that it was engines. Multiple engines, big ones. But these didn't sound like the road devils' motorcycles. These engines had a different pitch, deeper, more disciplined. They weren't revving and showing off like the bikers had been. They were just moving with steady, purposeful power. What the hell? The biker with the shaved head muttered. The rumbling got louder and louder. Soon it was impossible to ignore. Even the people inside the diner had stopped eating and were pressing against the windows, trying to see what was coming. Then they appeared around the corner. It was a formation of motorcycles, but not the kind you'd see at a rally or cruising down the highway on a weekend. These were military-style bikes painted in dark colors with no flashy chrome or custom paint jobs. The riders wore tactical gear instead of leather jackets. They rode in perfect formation, 2 by 2, like soldiers on parade. Behind the motorcycles came 3 black SUVs with tinted windows. Government-looking vehicles that seemed to mean serious business. Tank's mouth fell open. What in the Sam Hill? The formation pulled into the parking lot with military precision. The motorcycles formed a wide circle around the confrontation, but they didn't rev their engines or make any noise. The riders simply stopped and waited, their hands resting on their handlebars. The SUVs parked near the diner entrance. Men in dark suits and tactical gear got out, but they didn't rush forward or draw weapons. They just stood by their vehicles and watched. Betty's phone rang. She answered it calmly, as if having a dozen armed men appear in a parking lot was the most normal thing in the world. Jenkins here, she said. Tank couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could see Betty nodding. Understood, she said. No immediate threat, just some gentlemen who seemed to have forgotten their manners. She hung up and put the phone back in her purse. The lead motorcycle rider removed his helmet. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of bearing that came from years of military service. He didn't dismount his bike, but he looked directly at Bet. Tie with obvious respect, ma'am, he said with a slight nod. Everything under control here? Just fine, Peterson, Betty replied. These young men were just leaving. Tank looked from Betty to the newcomers and back again. His face had gone from red to pale white in the span of about 30 seconds. Who are you people? He stammered. Betty smiled for the first time since this whole encounter began. It wasn't a mean smile or a mocking one. It was almost gentle, like she was talking to a confused child. Well, she said, I suppose that depends on who's asking. To my grandchildren, I'm just Grandma Betty who makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. To the ladies at church, I'm the one who organizes the annual bake sale and visits shut-ins on Sundays. She paused and looked directly at Tank. But to these gentlemen, she gestured toward the men who had just arrived. I'm Colonel Elizabeth Jenkins, United States Army. Retired. The silence that followed was so complete that Betty could hear the air conditioning unit humming inside the diner. Tank's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. The other bikers looked like they wanted to disappear into the asphalt. 30 years of service, Betty continued conversationally. 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I retired with the rank of full colonel, and I commanded over 2,000 soldiers during my career. She gestured again toward the men on motorcycles. These are some of my former unit members. We still meet monthly, and we maintain radio contact for emergencies. When I say code silver, they know I need assistance. Tank finally found his voice. You're really a colonel? Was, Betty corrected. I'm retired now. But old habits die hard. These men still call me ma'am, and they still show up when I need them. The man called Peterson spoke up from his motorcycle. Orders, ma'am? Betty looked at Tank and his 5 friends. They looked like they wanted to crawl under their motorcycles and hide. I think, Betty said slowly, that these gentlemen just realized they made a mistake. Didn't you, boys? Tank stared at Betty like he was seeing her for the first time. The elderly woman in the simple church dress and worn sneakers had somehow transformed before his eyes. She stood differently now with the kind of posture that came from decades of command. Her voice carried an authority that made grown men want to stand up straighter and pay attention. You're really a colonel, he said again, like he was trying to convince himself it was true. I really am, Betty confirmed. Was. 30 years of my life dedicated to serving this country and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. She looked around at the 6 bikers, who suddenly seemed much smaller than they had a few minutes ago, which makes what just happened here particularly disappointing. She continued, 6 grown men deciding to intimidate an elderly woman in a parking lot. I've seen a lot of ugly things in my time, but bullying someone's grandmother has to rank pretty high on the list. The thin biker with the long hair looked like he might be sick. We didn't know, he mumbled. We thought you were just what? Betty asked. Just some helpless old lady who would be too scared to stand up for herself. Someone you could push around without consequences? Peterson, the man who had removed his helmet, finally dismounted his motorcycle. He walked over to join the conversation, his tactical boots making solid sounds on the asphalt. Up close, Tank could see that Peterson wasn't just some weekend warrior playing dress-up. This was a real soldier, with the kind of calm competence that came from facing actual danger. Ma'am, Peterson said to Betty, would you like us to escort these gentlemen out of the area? Betty considered this for a moment. Not just yet, Peterson. I think they might want to hear a story first. She turned back to Tank and his crew. You see, boys, the thing about being in the military is that you learn not to judge people by how they look. Some of the toughest soldiers I ever knew were barely 5 feet tall. Some of the best leaders I served with were women who didn't look like they could hurt a fly. She gestured toward the diner, where people were still watching through the windows. I bet when you rode up here today you looked around for the easiest target, someone who wouldn't fight back, someone who would just hand over whatever you wanted without causing any trouble. Tank couldn't meet her eyes, neither could any of his friends. And you picked me, Betty continued, because I'm old, because I'm a woman, because I was alone, because you thought I'd be too scared or too weak to do anything about it. The biker with the shaved head shuffled his feet. Look, lady, ma'am, we were just having some fun. We weren't really going to hurt anybody. Betty's expression hardened. Fun? You call threatening someone fun? Taking their money? Their car? That's fun to you? It's what we do, the man said weakly. It's what you do, Betty repeated. Well, let me tell you what I used to do. I used to command a medical unit in Baghdad. We treated soldiers who had been hurt by people who thought intimidation and violence were fun. She walked closer to the group of bikers. None of them backed away, but they all looked uncomfortable. I remember one young man, Betty said, couldn't have been more than 20 years old. He got hit by a roadside bomb while he was delivering supplies to an orphanage. Lost both his legs and part of his left arm. The parking lot was completely quiet except for Betty's voice. When he woke up in our field hospital, you know what he asked me? He didn't ask about his legs. He didn't ask if he was going to make it home. He asked if the children at the orphanage were okay, if the supplies had made it through. Betty looked at each of the bikers in turn. That young man was barely older than some of you, But he had more courage and more honor in his little finger than you've shown here today. Tank finally found his voice again. Ma'am, we're sorry. We didn't mean... You didn't mean what? Betty interrupted. You didn't mean to scare me? You didn't mean to threaten me? You didn't mean to try to take my money and my car? She shook her head. No, you meant every bit of it. The only thing you didn't mean to do was get caught. Peterson spoke up from behind her. Colonel, what are your orders? Betty was quiet for a long moment, studying the 6 men who had surrounded her car just a few minutes ago. They looked very different now. Smaller, ashamed, like children who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong. You know, she said finally, I could have Peterson and his men handle this the military way. A few phone calls and you'd all be facing assault charges, intimidation charges, maybe attempted robbery. Tank's face went white. Please, ma'am, we'll leave. We'll never come back here. We'll never bother anybody again, will you? Betty asked. Or will you just be more careful next time? Pick someone who doesn't have backup coming. She walked back to her car and leaned against it, looking suddenly tired. The problem with bullies, she said, is that they don't usually stop being bullies just because they get caught once. They just get better at picking their targets. The biker with the long hair spoke up. What do you want us to do? Betty looked at him with interest. Now that's a good question. What do I want you to do? She thought about it for a moment. I want you to understand something. Every person you've ever threatened, every person you've ever intimidated, every person you've ever scared just for the fun of it, they're all somebody's grandmother. Somebody's mother, somebody's daughter. She gestured toward the diner. The people watching us right now? They have families. They have grandchildren. They have hopes and dreams and fears just like you do. Betty pushed herself away from her car and stood up straight again. So here's what's going to happen. You have a choice. You can face the legal consequences of what you tried to do here today. Or... She paused, letting the word hang in the air. Or? Tank asked. Betty smiled, but it wasn't a mean smile. It was the kind of smile teachers used when they saw potential in a student who had been making poor choices. Or, you can spend the next 6 months proving that you're better men than you showed me today. Tank looked at Betty with confusion written all over his face. What do you mean, prove we're better men? Betty walked back toward the group, her hands clasped behind her back in a way that reminded everyone watching that she had spent 3 decades as a military officer. I work at the Veterans Affairs Hospital downtown, she said. 3 days a week, I volunteer with patients who are dealing with post-traumatic stress. Young men and women who came back from places like Iraq and Afghanistan with wounds you can't see. She looked directly at Tank. Some of them are younger than you. Most of them have seen things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life, and every single one of them has more courage and honor than you showed here today. The thin biker with the long hair shifted uncomfortably. What's that got to do with us? Everything, Betty said simply. See, these young veterans, they're struggling. They have trouble sleeping, trouble trusting people, trouble believing that the world is a safe place. And you know why? She didn't wait for an answer. Because they've seen what happens when good people don't stand up to bullies. They've seen what happens when people with power use it to hurt people who can't fight back. Betty gestured toward Peterson and the other men who had responded to her call. These men understand service. They understand what it means to use their strength to protect others instead of preying on them. Tank looked around at the tactical gear, the disciplined formation, the quiet competence of the soldiers who had appeared so quickly. How did they get here so fast? Because we never really retire, Peterson said from behind his motorcycle. We stay in touch. We stay ready, and when one of our own needs help, we show up. Betty nodded. That's what real men do. They protect people. They serve something bigger than themselves. They use their strength to lift others up, not to tear them down. She turned back to the bikers. So here's my offer. You can face charges for what you tried to do here today. Assault, intimidation, attempted robbery. With all these witnesses and all that cell phone video, I'd say you're looking at serious jail time. Tank's face went pale again. Or you can spend the next 6 months volunteering at the VA hospital with me. Every Saturday morning, 8 hours a day, you'll help with recreational therapy, you'll assist with physical therapy sessions, and you'll listen to stories from real heroes. The biker with the shaved head spoke up. You want us to work at a hospital? I want you to serve, Betty corrected. I want you to understand what it means to help people instead of hurting them. I want you to see what real courage looks like. She walked closer to the group. Some of these veterans lost limbs. Some lost their sight. Some came back with brain injuries that changed everything about who they are. But they're still fighting. They're still trying to build good lives. They're still believing in tomorrow. Betty's voice softened. And maybe if you spend enough time around real heroes, you'll figure out how to be heroes yourselves. Tank looked at his friends, then back at Betty. And if we do this, you won't press charges? That depends, Betty said. If you show up every Saturday for 6 months, if you work hard, if you treat those veterans with the respect they deserve, then yes. I'll consider the matter settled. And if we don't? The thin biker asked. Peterson stepped forward. Then you'll be dealing with us, he said quietly. And we won't be as generous as the colonel. Tank swallowed hard. 6 months? 6 months, Betty confirmed. And not just showing up. Really working. Really learning. Really changing. She pulled a business card out of her purse and handed it to Tank. My name is Elizabeth Jenkins. Colonel Elizabeth Jenkins. That card has my phone number and the address of the VA hospital. Tank took the card with shaking hands. You have until next Saturday to decide. Betty continued. Show up at 8 in the morning ready to work and we'll forget this ever happened. Don't show up and I'll file charges that afternoon. She looked around at all 6 bikers. And gentlemen, if I ever hear about you intimidating anyone else anywhere else, the deal is off. I have friends in a lot of places and the veteran community is smaller than you think. Peterson nodded in agreement. We look out for each other, and we look out for people who can't protect themselves. Betty walked back to her car and finally managed to get her key in the lock. The simple action that had seemed impossible just a few minutes ago now felt perfectly natural. Ma'am, Tank called out as she opened her door. Why are you giving us a chance? After what we tried to do? Betty paused with one foot in her car. Because 30 years ago I met a young soldier who had made some bad choices. Got mixed up with the wrong crowd, ended up in legal trouble. A good officer gave him a choice between jail and service. She smiled at the memory. That young soldier turned out to be one of the finest men I ever served with. He saved lives. He protected his fellow soldiers. He came home and became a teacher. Betty got into her car, but she rolled down the window before starting the engine. His name was Robert Jenkins, she said. He was my husband. Tank's mouth fell open. Your husband was a second-chance success story, Betty finished. Just like you could be if you choose to be. She started her car and began to back out of the parking space. Peterson and his men remounted their motorcycles, preparing to escort her safely out of the area. Next Saturday, Betty called through her window. 8 in the morning. Don't be late. As she drove away, Tank looked down at the business card in his hands. In simple black letters, it read, Elizabeth Jenkins, Colonel, Retty, U.S. Army, Volunteer Coordinator, Veterans Affairs Hospital. 6 months later, Tank and his 5 friends were still showing up every Saturday morning. They had heard stories that changed how they saw the world. They had met young men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country. They had learned what real strength looked like. And 3 of them, including Tank himself, had liked the work so much that they signed up to become permanent volunteers. The Road Devils Motorcycle Club quietly disbanded. In its place, the 6 former members started a new group that escorted elderly, veterans to medical appointments and helped with yard work for military families. They called themselves the Honor Guard. And every Saturday morning, they still showed up to work with Colonel Betty Jenkins, the elderly woman who had taught them that real power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Murphy's Diner put up a small plaque by the front door. It read, In honor of all veterans who served with courage and continue to serve with compassion. Below that, in smaller letters, dedicated to Colonel Elizabeth Jenkins, who reminds us that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Betty never asked for the plaque, and she was embarrassed when they unveiled it. But every month when she came for lunch with the ladies from church, she would glance at it and smile, because sometimes the best victories weren't won on battlefields. Sometimes they were won in parking lots, one changed heart at a time.